Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hidden Histories Collective. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. And as always, we are so appreciative of all of your likes, your subscribes, your sharing of our videos. This means everything to us because this is what we do it for. So, tonight I want to really dive deep into the 14th Amendment because any day now we will be hearing from the Supreme Court regarding the birthright citizenship case. And it's going to be incredibly historic because this is a particular case that is long time overdue and it's going to affect many people in the future. So, but part of what we're going to do tonight is give everyone a deep dive into the 14th Amendment, talk a bit about what the immigration laws have done and how we got here, and to try to unravel this and unpack it for everybody. But I want to say that off the top, the 14th Amendment was meant for slaves, basically, and emancipating the slaves. And that is really at the heart of the 14th Amendment for those who aren't aware and don't quite understand the full scope of it. But, again, we're going to get into the depth of it. And as you guys can see from the table of contents, we're going to be covering the initial thoughts I have on this whole affair. Then we'll talk a bit about the executive order, post Civil War amendments. The 14th Amendment, we'll do a deep dive into it as well. We'll talk about the civil rights case, Wong Kim Arc, that was decided in 1898. And then we'll talk about the modern misuse of the 14th Amendment and what will the Supreme Court decide. That will be, of course, conjecture, but we're going to stick within the lines and confines of the law to come up with our kind of estimates. So let's just dive right in. But I want to give you guys my initial thoughts. And sometimes I save this for the latter part of the video, but I really want to do this now because I think if we frame this coming out the gate, then it's going to really settle into us because this is also an ethical and a moral decision that's going to be made here as well. And, part of it for me is, I'm a mix of many different things when it comes to my culture and my background, but I identify primarily with the indigenous side of myself because that is the majority of it. So, but I want to first say to start off that the 14th Amendment then versus now looks really different. So the 14th Amendment was really a moral correction to a national sin. But what's happened, it's been twisted to cover an entirely different crisis. And in doing so, we've created a nation full of children with rights no one can protect. It is amazing how we have gotten here. And I say that with the utmost of respect and honor and understanding of what is happening to our nation now with regard to the children of undocumented parents, right? But I have to ask this question, again, the 14th Amendment was forged in the aftermath of slavery, and it was really meant to restore humanity and legal dignity to a people who were once considered property, which were my ancestors. Okay. And I want to ask everyone, how do we protect the legacy of the 14th Amendment without distorting its purpose? Because I think that's why many Black people in particular have strayed away from having too much of an opinion, I should say, a conclusive opinion, if you will, about immigration and birthright citizenship, because for us, it means something very different. The 14th Amendment means something incredibly different for us when it comes to birthright citizenship. So, my question is, I have a couple. Should the children of undocumented parents be granted the same birthright as the children of those who once had none, or worse, whose indigenous birthright was stripped almost entirely from this land? I'm going to let that sit there for a minute because when I think about this from a personal perspective as an indigenous person, I'm sitting here saying to myself, I'm still trying to piece together my birthright. To be quite honest with you, I'm still trying to piece that together. And many of us understand this. We're putting together our family trees. We're, you know, doing interviews with our loved ones and those who are still living. And we are doing so much research to piece together what was broken. And the 14th Amendment was part of what, at least for a moment, allowed us to do that. Okay. Now, we were in that incredible limbo of, are we citizens or are we not? Are we indigenous or are we not? So that's a whole nother video in itself, but I just wanted to ask that question because I think it's very important for people to be thinking about that, particularly in the context of what we call the quote unquote African American. Now, I'm going to even take it a step further and say, should the children of undocumented parents receive the same automatic citizenship as the children of even those who fought, waited, and sacrificed to become Americans through the long and difficult naturalization process? That's a really real question, too. Because for many immigrants, particularly ones that I've spoken to and were my friends, that process was very lengthy for them, at least a decade or more, right? So they had to go through a process to become American citizens. They had to go through a process. And, to use a social experiment, you guys know that you don't really want anybody cutting in front of you in the line. You don't. I don't care if you're grocery shopping or waiting for your prescriptions or even waiting for your food. You really don't want anybody cutting in front of you in the line. You want people to go in the back. And even if you're the nice one and you say, oh, hey, yeah, you can go ahead of me, the people behind you are going to complain. So this is a real question. And we have to begin thinking about this from an ethical perspective, moral perspective, and legal perspective, right? So I just wanted to frame this discussion that we're about to have. And it may feel like commentary for some people, but really I'm asking a real ethical question. And you go back and you think about it. I know some of you already have a response, but I think it's really important to at least begin to think about that. So, with all that being said, let's dive in. So, the birthright citizenship really became an issue when President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14161 titled Protecting the Meaning and Value of American Citizenship, right? So, what that did was it prohibited U.S. federal agencies from issuing or recognizing citizenship documents, passports, social security numbers for children born in the U.S. when either their mother or the father were not U.S. citizens, or I should say, either unlawfully present in the U.S. or lawfully present temporarily. Okay, so that was really, really important for that executive order to make really clear that going forward, at least from the president's perspective, that there was not going to be any automatic birthright citizenships for people who were unlawfully present in the United States. Okay, now what that did was the changes were scheduled to take effect 30 days later. So basically on February 19th, and that applied only to births on or after that date. Now, again, children born on or after that date to undocumented parents or temporary visa holders were not automatically granted U.S. citizens, even if they were born on U.S. soil. So, for instance, right now, if your baby was born on or after that date, your baby doesn't have birthright citizenship right now. That's just the way it is from the perspective of the president. Okay. So that includes no birth certificate, social security number, or passport or proof of citizenship. So there's going to be many parents who've had children during that time that are probably going to be waiting with anticipation to see what the Supreme Court says as well. So it's a huge, huge case that is going to leave some people in legal limbo, which they are right now. So let's talk about the post-Civil War amendments, because we talk about the 14th Amendment, but it was a collective group of amendments that were created, right? So in 1865, as many of you know, the 13th Amendment was officially proclaimed, and the abolishment of slavery and involuntary servitude went into effect. And it was the first of the three Reconstruction or Civil War amendments that was passed. That was 1865. Now, in 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868 after the Civil War. So it also included what we now know to have a Citizenship Clause, which broadly defined citizenship, and it superseded the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, right? So, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So pay very special attention to the phrase to the jurisdiction thereof, because I will be covering that. So that happened in 1868. And then in 1870, now we have the third or the last of the Reconstruction Amendments, which was the 15th Amendment, which allowed citizens the right to vote. So you free the slaves, you give them citizenship, and then you allow them the right to vote, right? So there were three amendments that were all tied together. So, and this is very important for people to understand, because sometimes when people talk about the 14th Amendment, they talk about it as if it's a standalone, and it really wasn't. It was actually a combined kind of story that was being amended to the Constitution, right? Now, let's dive into the 14th Amendment and talk a little bit about that. Okay. Now, again, it was ratified in 1868 after the Civil War, and it was really designed to nullify the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which, as you guys know, the Dred Scott decision basically said that if you were African American and you were a slave, that you were not a U.S. citizen. You could not be granted citizenship. So that's a whole nother video that I will be doing in the future, because it was a really, really important case, and it caused a major uproar in the United States at the time the decision was made. And in many cases, folks will say that it was probably one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in history. Now, once the amendment was ratified, granted freedom to freed slaves. So again, remember, freed slaves were not just the quote unquote African Americans. You're talking about whites too. There were Indians. So there were many different people in the country who were slaves, right? And you guys have seen me talk about this in other videos, and please refer to some of them, because I do talk about this in length. So when we talk about the slaves, we are also talking about a subset of slaves that people just don't talk about. No one wants to go into that detail, but that's true. So what it also did was it reinforced the federal authority over Southern states who were denying Black citizenship, i.e., the Black Codes. Now, the Black Codes were basically laws that Southern states were implementing, and it was almost putting, not almost, but in some ways, it was putting many Black people back into slavery again, and the folks and Congress said, no, we're not going to do that. So in essence, the 14th Amendment was crafted to establish civil rights protections for newly freed slaves and to counter the Black Codes, or state laws passed in the South to restrict the freedom of former slaves. So that is the 14th Amendment. Now, I want to share with you guys some of the key figures who were very instrumental in writing that amendment and in giving it life. And one of those people was John Bingham, and he was a radical Republican out of Ohio. He was an abolitionist and the principal framer of the amendment. And Bingham was also focused on nationalizing the Bill of Rights. So he was a key figure there. We also have Jacob Howard out of Michigan. He was another Republican senator. He had many different titles in Michigan: city attorney for Detroit. He was the attorney general for Michigan as well. And as a senator, he was the chief sponsor of the False Claims Act, which permitted whistleblowers to file lawsuits against the government contractors for fraud. So, if we know anything about whistleblowers, we know how vital they are to uncovering fraud, uncovering deception, and corruption. And Jacob Howard was one of those lawmakers who wanted to protect the whistleblowers, which I think he has fascinating history all by himself. And then, of course, we have Thaddeus Stevens out of Pennsylvania. Now, he was one of the main leaders of the radical Republicans faction of the Republican Party during the 1860s. And he was a fierce opponent of slavery and discrimination against Black Americans. And Stevens sought to secure their rights during Reconstruction and leading the opposition to U.S. President Andrew Johnson as well. And he played a leading role in defeating the Confederacy. So all three of these men had significant reasons behind why they were putting together these amendments. And really, when you think about it, you know, if these amendments had not been put in place, we'd still, even though the war might have quote unquote ended, we would have still had slavery, just by another name. Now, what's really important, particularly with regard to the 14th Amendment, is the Citizenship Clause. And in Section 1 of that, it says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States in the state wherein they reside. So pay very close attention to that, because I'm going to dive into that a bit. Now, one of the things that we talk about when we look at Supreme Court cases or we look at amendments and all of these things is what was the original intent of the author, or what was the original intent of that particular, amendment or particular clause or article in the Constitution. And one of the things we turn to, of course, is yes, we have the document itself, but we also have to go to the horse, basically, and say, well, what did the horse say? Now, when Jacob Howard was debating this amendment, and his fellow senators and reps were asking questions for clarification, this is what he said regarding citizenship. This amendment which I have offered is simply declaratory of what I regard as the law of the land already, that every person born within the limits of the United States and subject to their jurisdiction is by virtue of natural law and national law a citizen of the United States. This will not, of course, include persons born in the United States who are foreigners, aliens who belong to the families of ambassadors or foreign ministers accredited to the government of the United States, but will include every other class of person. So Jacob Howard made it clear that if you were a U.S. citizen, you were within the jurisdiction of the United States, and you were of the allegiance, if you will, of the United States, no other foreign entity. Right? Now, of course, you guys can read the debates. You can read what was written for yourself. I'll be providing links in the description so you guys can go and read that for yourselves. Now, there was another senator by the name of John Conness out of California who also was making distinctions and trying to get clarity from Howard. And he knew it to be that U.S. citizens were actually subject to the laws of the land. And he said, quote, "And the amendment says citizenship may depend upon birth, and I know of no better way to give rise to citizenship than the fact of birth within the territory of the United States, born of parents who at the time were subject to the authority of the United States." Again, you can read his his questions, his quotes, all of that in the Congressional Globe, and read what was said back and forth. So, in other words, many of the senators already understood that the phrase "subject to the jurisdiction thereof" was clearly meant to filter out people who, despite being born here, were not legally or politically under full U.S. authority. So they had to make that distinction because remember, there were also the indigenous tribes who were, of course, their own nation, sovereign nation. And so they didn't even consider the Indians at that particular time. But, and of course, as you guys know, there was an Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, which is a whole video in itself. So Howard's quote makes it clear that the 14th Amendment's framers drew a clear line between citizens by allegiance and those merely present by circumstance. Citizenship was never intended as a geographic accident, it was a legal and political relationship. And and I want to sidebar a little bit. If for those of you who are not familiar with the naturalization process in the U.S. right now, part of even getting your being eligible for citizenship is that you have to take civics classes, you have to take English classes, like you have to really understand the history and civics of the United States. It's not enough just to say, "Hey, I'm here. I'm an American. I'm sitting here on the land." You have to really know this country, and there's no exception with that. Okay, so but we're going to talk little bit about this other Supreme Court case called the United States versus Wong Kim Arc. Now, the reason why this particular case is probably going to be significant is it set a precedent for citizenship, and let's talk about that a little bit. So, Wong Kim Arc was a Chinese young man born in San Francisco, California, and specifically on Sacramento Street. And his address was that of a Chinatown business maintained by his parents. And that is quite significant because where you reside, in how long you've resided, was significant to this case. And it still is to this day when you apply for naturalization. So Wong Kim Arc's father and mother immigrated from China, but they were not United States citizens, as the naturalization law of 1802 had made them ineligible for naturalization either before or after his birth. So this is pretty significant because there was also the Chinese Exclusion Act that excluded Chinese from being citizens in the United States. But they were allowed to live and work in the United States lawfully. So the Chinese Exclusion Act, of course, as we know, is very discriminatory. I will say this, that it was still instrumental in establishing somewhat of a framework for citizenship and birthrights. So basically what happened to Wong Kim Arc was that he had left to go to China on a visit. He had gone twice. But the second time that he returned, he was detained at the port of San Francisco by the collector of customs, who denied him permission to enter the country. And they basically argued that Wong was not a U.S. citizen despite having been born in the U.S., but was instead a Chinese subject because his parents were Chinese. Now, his parents were already living in China at the time, but Ark had already been living in the United States. He continued living in the United States even after his parents went back to China. So while this case was being tried, Wong was confined for 5 months on steamships off the coast of San Francisco while his case was being tried. He didn't even have an opportunity to step on American soil again until after the case was finalized. So now there was a 6-2 ruling. The Supreme Court, it was a 6-2 ruling, and they basically said the child of an alien, if born in the country while the president is domiciled therein, becomes a citizen of the United States by virtue of the 14th Amendment. Now, basically, only lawfully present individuals with permanent residence or long-term legal status are considered domiciled in the U.S. birthright citizenship under Wong Kim Arc. That's why he was a child born to lawfully domiciled resident aliens. So what you'll find is that when people talk about Wong Kim Arc, they're sometimes leaving out the fact that his parents were lawfully domiciled resident aliens within the United States. Right? So that is something to be very, very mindful of and to remember, because it wasn't like they were living in the US unlawfully. They were lawfully able to reside in the US even though they were not citizens. So that is something to be very, very mindful of. Now, what's happening here is that there has been a modern misuse of the 14th Amendment all day, up and down, right? Now, what's happened now is because of the phrase that anyone who has a child born in the United States, you automatically become a U.S. citizen. Well, what has happened here is that now we have a child that's a U.S. citizen and a parent that's undocumented. So what this has created is automatically legal orphans. And what I mean by that is, because the parent is undocumented and is not a citizen, the parent really has no full legal standing in the United States. And so therefore the child's constitutional rights cannot be fully defended. So that means even hospitals, courts, and even schools may intervene or override the parent because the parent does not have legal authority here in the United States. And without getting into too much detail on all the different cases, you guys can do this research on your own. This has created just a hot mess, and it has become a very emotional moment for so many people. And no one wants to ever see children separated from their parents. But this is what has been happening for years. And this is why it has been happening, right? So you always have to ask yourself, why does this keep happening? And why is this such a surprise to everyone? Right? It's because the child is a US citizen, but the parent is not. Right? So what's happening is that we're having real life consequences from this. Parents are being deported. Sometimes kids are placed in foster care. Sometimes they're adopted out while the parent is detained. The courts are blocking custody decisions because the parents can't legally appear. Relatives can be guardians, but that in itself is still a legal process as well. So that is why when you're seeing these children in these courtrooms by themselves, it's because the parent is not legal or is not lawfully residing in the United States. So it is incredibly heartbreaking. It's just a hot mess. It's a hot mess, and it has been this way for years. So now, I want to talk about due process just a little bit, because I know that that has been a hot, hot topic, and people are talking about everyone should be given due process. And yes, you are constitutionally supposed to be receiving due process. Now, yes, undocumented persons have the right to a hearing, to be notified of the charges, and to present evidence. But if removal is legally ordered, those rights do not prevent deportation, because the irony about that is that you're not lawfully in the United States. So it's a bit of a legal quagmire that many undocumented people find themselves in, that yes, you have the right to talk to a judge and say why you should stay in the country, but you've already broken the law, you know. So when ICE shows up at a court, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's already an order of removal, but it can mean that one is in place or one is about to be pursued, right? So, but ICE may detain you if you miss court or violate terms of your status, if you have a criminal conviction or are charged with certain crimes, if you've had a prior removal order, even if you're now pursuing relief, and if you're flagged as a national security risk or repeated immigration violator. So I always I always look at each individual case with caution because I know there's much that I don't know about that particular case. So when you see people crying and saying, "Oh, they took my parent or they took my child or they what have you," we have to still understand that we don't know the dynamics of that individual case. We must know that case in order to really form any kind of real opinion, because there's a reason why they're being deported. And the very first reason why they're being deported is they were here unlawfully to begin with, right? So now we're going to get to what will the Supreme Court decide, and everyone's sitting on pins and needles because for the first time in over 125 years, we're finally going to deal with this issue head on, and it needs to be dealt with because it's just insane what's been happening. Now, this is just law. This is just conjecture, of course, because I'm not a lawyer. I just want to say that off the top. But I do want to say that knowing what I know and following Supreme Court cases for years and really understanding how they move, they are going to probably uphold the Wong case. They're going to uphold that because that's what the Supreme Court does. Not all the time, but the majority of the time, I'd say 70% of the time they do. And the reason why they will probably uphold it is because, one, he was born in the US and his parents were legally domiciled, even though they were not citizens. So, but the crucial part of that case is his parents were lawful permanent residents. So I don't see the Supreme Court overriding that because it's lawful. I don't see them reversing that and saying, oh, well, we're just going to let people into the country illegally. I'd be really, really surprised by the Supreme Court to reverse that Wong decision. I really would, because the reversal means you're reversing law and you're basically saying, oh, we can do illegal things now. I don't see them doing that. But of course, the ruling, the Wong Kim Arc ruling, did not address the children of illegal immigrants, temporary visa holders, or tourists. So the interpretation today could be the court upholds Wong while still narrowing who qualifies based on lawful presence. That's kind of my conjecture on that. Now, here's the big, big, big thing here, guys. The originalist. Now, what I mean by that is there's certain justices that view the Constitution through original public meaning they are going to do their research and really understand what was the original intent of that particular decision, amendment, clause, article, etc., etc., etc. So, like I said, they're probably going to preserve precedent. 1898, the ruling will probably still stand. The Wong Kim Arc ruling will probably still stand. They're also going to probably uphold the executive order or a narrower federal interpretation. And if you guys have been paying attention, they've been upholding some of President Donald Trump's executive orders. I won't go into all of those. That's another another topic for another day. But just really be paying attention to this. And the biggest thing is they're going to avoid rewriting the Constitution, but clarifying it in today's context. And that is huge because if I know a lot of people want to amend this and amend this and amend that, but we have to remember that the Constitution is pretty much set in stone, and to twiddle and tweak it to our modern specifications, I don't know. I mean, I know sometimes we feel like it's something that we want to do because we think it's an old document, and it is an old document. At the same time, it's been working for us. It really has been working for us. Okay. Now, stare decisis. Now, the court generally follows its own prior decisions unless there's a strong reason not to. right? This keeps the law stable and predictable, which is foundational to legal systems. We don't want to be writing new law on the spot, and I really don't think that the Supreme Court is going to be doing that, to be perfectly honest with you, because that's not what their job is to rewrite law on the spot. And overturning precedent is rare. It's not uncommon, as we know, looking at the Brown versus Board of Education, and Dobbs versus Jackson, which overturned Roe versus Wade. But the court has overturned more than 230 of its own prior decisions. But this is a tiny, tiny fraction of the 26,000 cases it has decided since 1789. Okay? So the courts will probably maintain precedent, and the precedent is the Wong Kim Arc case. Now, the other thing to remember, and I will end this video with this understanding, that the Immigration and Naturalization Act, the INA, one of the things that we must note is that the US government already distinguishes citizenship transmission based on the parent's citizenship status, resident duration in the US, and legal presence, right? So I'm pretty sure, because the Supreme Court is in many ways forced to have to deal with what the current immigration law says, will pretty much go in line with what the immigration and naturalization laws are right now. Okay, so that's real. I highly, highly doubt that the court is going to overturn ARC, particularly because overturning it means that you're going to have to now say, oh, we're going to give birthright citizenship to children who have unlawful or undocumented parents. That's going to contradict our current immigration laws as we have them now. Okay, so it may not always feel good to hear that, but that is the law. That is what we have in front of us. So there's so much to say about this, you guys, and I know it's a very emotional case for many, but I'm going to tell you, we have to do it. We have to ensure and make sure that we're following the law and being ethical and moral as we're doing it, because when we're not, this is what's happening to us. We create chaos and drama in our country. So that is the Hidden Histories Collective presentation on this. Please, I'd love your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. And please, please, please like, share, and subscribe if you are already not a subscriber. And we will be talking to you guys really soon and following up with you once the Supreme Court decision is made. And hopefully the next couple of weeks or so. You guys have an amazing evening.